Welcome back to the Metal Command Show. Tony here with you, and today I'm bringing you an interview with myself and Ken Mary. Ken plays drums in Flotsam and Jetsam. He played on the last two Flotsam and Jetsam albums. In my opinion, the two best albums that they have ever put out. He also plays in a band called Fifth Angel, which put out an amazing new record this year called Angels Kill. And, you know, he also played in a number of other great bands. Some of them you might have heard of. Alice Cooper, Impellitteri, House of Lords, and a number of other projects over the years. Ken was a great guy to talk to. This is a great interview, and without wasting any further time, check this interview out right now. And again, if you like what you hear and see on this podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video, and leave a comment. Check it out. So thanks for coming on the show. You've obviously...
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me, Tony.
And you obviously play and have played in some really great bands over the course of your career on the drums. And let's talk about this Fifth Angel album, When Angels Kill. And I'll give you a little short summary of how shocked I was when this band came back with the album before this. Definitely a much different sound than I was kind of expecting from the other two albums I had heard. So talk about this new album. This new album is very, very good. You have a lot of really great tracks on this. And how did this new album come together?
Well, first of all, thanks so much. And it's always great when somebody appreciates your art, because as you know, it's like there's just so much stuff out there and it's so easy to get lost in the shuffle. So thank you very much for the compliments. As far as, you know, how this came together, you know, it's been a bit of a rough and tumble road for Fifth Angel in general. Right. As you probably, if you know anything about the history of the band. But you know, the last album which was The Third Secret, the last album prior to this one anyway, that was really an easy record, and that came together very quickly. And you know, working with Kendall, you know, Kendall and John and I go, you know, way back, you know, we go back years, you know, some 20 some odd years or whatever. And I think before we made that record, I think it was a span of, you know, 20, I don't know, I'd have to check. Somebody's going to correct me on this, but I want to say like 26 years or something since we did an album. And
yeah, it was a long time.
For whatever reason, you know, we did hit upon a chemistry with the three of us, with Kendall, myself, and John. There was some real chemistry there, and it was actually, that album went together very fast, and we felt very strongly about the material. We really, we always try to please ourselves first, because we always think if we're not happy with it and we don't like it, why should anybody else like it? So that's really the story of the last one. And then if you want to kind of fast forward to this album was a little bit different, and it was not easy to put together. It took a very long time, and there was a family of players, you know, and writers that are kind of involved in this record. And I think overall it made for a much stronger record. And I think you said it yourself. You think this is probably the strongest of all the records. I agree with you 100%. I think this definitely was, in my opinion, you know, the best Fifth Angel album. But, you know, it's hard to compete with nostalgia, too. You know, there's a lot of fans that love those first two albums, and they're considered classics in Europe. I mean, there's diehard fans that just love those albums. So it's hard to come out and say, like, well, you know, I feel like this one's the best one. But I do. So as far as answering your question, which really was, you know, you're saying, how did this come about? Well, you know, we finished the last one, and that sort of helped us feel comfortable with doing another record, because I believe the old fans and the new fans really appreciated Third Secret. And we were very nervous initially about doing a record after the first two albums. We definitely didn't want to do a record that would let our listeners down, or we feel didn't equal or compare with the first two albums. So it was a very nerve-wracking time. Like, we really felt like we had something, but you never know how people are going to respond to it. And it's a different singer. You know, it's Kendall singing instead of Ted. And, you know, but, you know, I really love Kendall's voice, so I didn't have a problem. So, then on this album, we have yet another, we have Steve Carlson, who's, in my opinion, I think is an incredible vocalist. I love his voice. I love what happened on this record. But again, you don't know how fans are going to respond. So the process, I mean, I've talked for a long time, so I'm going to let you get something in here. And then if you want me to elaborate on the actual process of how it came together, I'll be happy to do that.
Sure. Well, obviously you mentioned something just now, a long wait between the last album and then obviously the Third Secret. So, I know nothing about the history of the band other than I like the first two albums, and that when the Third Secret came out, I was shocked in a very good way of how that album came out. So kind of give us a background of the history of the band a little bit. And, obviously the band had not been around in a very long time. So
yes.
What was the reason for that? And what really prompted you to resurrect this band again?
Sure. Well, the first two, if you want to go back to the original history of the band, we came out of the same era that, Queensryche, Metal Church, Heir Apparent. There was like a whole metal scene going on in Seattle. People think of Seattle and they think of grunge, but before grunge, Seattle was a great metal town, and there were great metal bands coming out. And so we saw what happened with Queensryche. We knew some of the guys in the band. And we saw, they basically didn't worry about playing live. They just worried about making a great recording and writing, and they really concentrated on that. And I remember being at Lake Sammamish and seeing Chris DeGarmo, and they were spending their own money, making their own EP. And he was telling me about it, and he's like, yeah, we hope something happens with it. You got to take your chance. You got to risk your money and your time. So obviously what happened there was that album, was picked up by Kerrang! Magazine, which was a huge European magazine. They loved it. And the rest is history. I mean, they basically ended up touring with Dio, I think, on their first tour. And so, they had a very, exciting launch to their album. And we saw what happened and we said, hey, let's be smart. Let's do the same thing. And Ted, Ed, and myself had been in a band since we were kids. I mean, they saw me drum when I was in junior high and got me in their band, and they were in high school. So that's how far back we go together. And we added James Bird, and James Bird, added some of those guitars on that first album that I think were really pretty amazing. And the band put out, we got picked up by Shrapnel Records out of California, and then it ended up getting picked up by Epic Records out of New York, and they flew out and took us to dinner, and we signed a $27 million record deal, which was over 7 albums, which for that era, $21 million. And it was a huge deal for that time period. So people were pretty excited about the band. Everybody felt like we were going to be the next Iron Maiden or something. And we felt that way too. So then after, we did another record, and this is, starting to edge towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, and grunge started kind of hitting in Seattle. And, so we knew there was a big rumble going on, and we didn't understand that it was going to completely terminate the existence of pretty much everything else. You were either grunge or you weren't. And the fans were pretty ruthless back then. And so bands like, Fifth Angel and even Metal Church, and, the only band that kind of escaped that wrath was Queensryche.
Yeah.
They had Empire that came out in, I think, 92, 93, and somehow they managed to transcend that and they escaped it. But we certainly were caught up in it. We lost our deal, and nothing really happened with the band until 2010, when the band played a festival in Europe called KIT, which is called Keep It True. And it's a huge festival over there. And the response to the band was really kind of off the hook. And that was the first time we really realized, well, in Europe, we really have an audience, maybe not so much in the United States, but we did in Europe. And that was sort of the rebirth of the band, so to speak.
Sure. Absolutely. So now, this this new album, you brought Jim Dofka in, and I bring it up because I've known him for quite a while. And describe what it was like bringing him in, and he plays a lot of the lead guitar stuff, basically a lot of the guitar solos on the album.
Pretty much almost all the guitar solos on the album are Jim. Okay. And working with Jim was actually kind of a fluke. He hired me to play on his album, and so that's how I first was introduced to him. I was actually working for him. And then, he did such an amazing job on his own music that, basically, Kendall, as you may or may not know, this is part of the Fifth Angel saga, but Kendall stepped out, ironically, almost, right after the album was done and coming out. He decided he didn't want to play live anymore. He didn't want to tour anymore. And it would have been a nice thing to find out maybe before the record, before we did the record. That would have been nice to find out. Yeah. But so on this new album, we had no Kendall, and Kendall was lead vocals and he was lead guitar. And so, along came Steve Carlson and Jim Dofka, and, they both did, an incredible job. I think Steve just did an amazing job on vocals. And then Jim, I can't really say enough about, how he handled the Fifth Angel material, because we did have something specific in mind. We kind of wanted to harken back to the solos more like that would be on the first album, which were very structured, very organized, almost an orchestrated piece within themselves. And so we were looking for something very specific. And Jim is he's a virtuoso and an amazing guitarist. And in my opinion, like I love his guitar work on this album. I feel like it's, like you feel like it's the best album. I feel like it's some of the best guitar work that we've had. And he doesn't necessarily agree with that, but I'll publicly say it. I think he just did a phenomenal job on the record. We couldn't really be happier with how those solos really added to the experience of the album. I mean, it's just, he did just beautiful work, and the harmonies are beautiful, and he just did a fantastic job.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Jim's a guitar teacher, if I remember correctly as well. So, he's probably used to teaching people song structures, and he's able to probably apply that with his, obviously he's got tremendous ability to this record. When I say that this is the best album, I look at this band. Obviously there's two different eras. You have the stuff from the 80s, and then you have the new stuff. And it's not just this band, but I could say this about a lot of bands that came out of the 80s, that in my opinion, many of them are putting out better stuff than they were, back in the 80s. I mean, they become better songwriters, they become older, they become wiser. I can just name a lot of bands, and not all, but there are quite a few that do that. And I always feel that, like, sometimes people get stuck on older albums and don't want to think that anything could be better than that, right? But I think that this era, you guys stepped into the more modern times and really brought the band up. It doesn't sound dated. If people go and listen to this, and I remember I was playing, I remember people that didn't know who you were, I played some songs off of the first couple records, and then I go and play this new album, and they're like, oh my God, a lot of people like the newer stuff a lot better. I could even say the same thing about, Flotsam and Jetsam is a good example.
Sure. Yeah.
I think the last two albums that you played on with them are the two best records they've ever done, songwriting wise, just everything, so
I agree. What's funny, well, I love their first two albums. The first two albums, Flotsam albums, to me are kind of, they really are cutting edge for their time. And if you go listen, the thing that I always think of with artists is you have to, like even Fifth Angel, if you go back to that era and what was being played, I am proud of those first two albums, because they sound like we had Pro Tools and we didn't. We were very young, but we really cared about making an excellent record. And, but I do agree with you. I think on the Flotsam stuff, two of my favorite albums are the last two albums. And it's hard to say because you were involved in it. But as a fan, like I listen to those records in my car for fun, which, I can't tell you, I've played on a bajillion albums, and there's not a lot of albums I would put in my car and listen to just for fun, because usually when you're done with them, you've heard them like, 500 times, and, you're just done, you don't want to hear them ever again. And, the Flotsam stuff, the Fifth Angel stuff, I mean, I still enjoy listening to this. So,
yeah,
from my opinion, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Well, I look at it. It's interesting. You say that with, like I said, with Flotsam and Jetsam. I've listened to that band. I've done this show 25 years, and I've listened to that band, for almost 30 years. And I've been there when a lot of these. I mean, the early stuff, I was probably too young when it came out, but early 90s, I got into them. I loved, like you said, I loved the first two albums. I really loved the debut album a lot. And, over the course of time, there's some records I've liked. There's some that I haven't liked as much, but I remember they kind of sort of started resurrecting themselves. The album, I think it was called The Cold, right?
Yeah.
And then that came out, and I'm like, man, these guys put out some great stuff. And then these last two records. Now, when I get these albums, a lot of times I don't have time to go look at who's playing on them. First I hear Eric's voice, and I hear the music, and I'm like, man, these guys are awesome. Then I start looking at who plays on the record, and I looked at your name, and I'm like, that's the guy from Fifth Angel. That's what I remember. I remember Fifth Angel and Alice Cooper. That's what I remember.
Sure.
And I agree, man. They've, and it's not just a modern production; it's the songwriting. When I go and I say these albums are much better than what they did before, the songwriting, in my opinion, is just a lot better. It's more refined. I mean, you listen to stuff in the 80s, I'm sure a lot of people that are listening, that are younger, that listen to this, don't realize that when you write a record back then, the amount of money that it cost to record it, because you had 2-inch tape, each tape was like 15 minutes, 4 tracks, something like that per tape. And you're talking $150 back then. That's old. That's not money now. That's $150 back then. Right. Which for inflation's probably $500-600. And before you know it, you got production costs. You got people that gotta mix it. You got to pay a lot of money for that. I mean, a production could cost, $100,000 back then was actually usually the par back in the old days. I mean, that's how it was.
Well, I think the second Fifth Angel album with Terry Brown, who was Rush's producer.
Yeah.
I think we spent $230,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
Or, somewhere around there, because you have your producer's fee, that's $40,000 right off the top. Mm-hmm. Then you have studio time and travel, and we recorded in New York City, and just a bit of trivia here. I actually recorded that album on Eric Carr from Kiss's. That was his drum set that's on that second album, cool. which is kind of cool, because I have some photos. He was such a nice guy. I mean, I met him a few times. And, back when I was in House of Lords, and we rehearsed from the same place in Los Angeles, but super nice guy, sweetheart guy. But it's just one of those little, weird bits of information that a lot of people don't know. But as far as, these albums and the quality, I think it is easier now, like when you have, like, I have a full SSL studio, with, it's like a world-class recording studio, and everybody has their home studios now. So I think it does make the writing, and you can change a song. Like back in the day with when Fifth Angel first was recording, you had to arrange everything and have it in stone before you even walked into the studio. Mm-hmm. And nowadays you could be working on a song, and you could be coming down to the mix, and you could say, you know what, I want an extra 2 bars, in before this solo, and I want this, I want to double the chorus at the end, and I want to do this and do that. And so you can make all these decisions when the picture is becoming more clear, that in the past you weren't able to do that. So, I think that might be some of the reason why I think that, the records are getting better. I think because the technology allows you to make more creative decisions even as the process is going on. And I do want to point out one thing real quick too. I just want to bring up Steve Conley, because Steve Conley also played a very important part in the Fifth Angel, When Angels Kill album. Our original guitar player, Ed, was having severe hand problems and wasn't able to record for quite a while. And Steve was able to, he's my buddy from Flotsam, and he was able to step in and, help out with the rhythm tracks and some of the writing. And that's why I said there was like a family of players. Ethan Brosh, another great player, fabulous guy and fabulous player. He co-wrote 2 of the songs. And, it was almost like a Fifth Angel family, so to speak. So I just wanted to point out that, there's another couple of guys that are very important to the process. And I just wanted to kind of mention them because I feel like, they did bring a lot to the table. And all the people that were involved in this record, really, I think it made the album, what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you guys now, I know right now it's very tough for bands to really kind of go on the road, play a lot of shows. The cost of everything's gone way up. It's promoters are a lot less likely to invest in shows. They really rely on a lot of things. It's a lot different now than say when you started, doing this so many years ago. And do you guys have any shows though to, that you maybe want to announce that you're going to be playing anywhere, or is it just kind of like wait and see?
Well, we do. I mean, I do think we have shows booked. I'm trying to remember. There's a Prague Fest, I think, in Atlanta in September. I think we also have some European dates in September too. I'm not sure exactly what they are. I know we have a festival in Greece, or 2. I think there's 2 of them in Greece, and then there's some other shows coming up in Germany. So there are definitely shows that will be happening, but you're correct. I mean, I think COVID changed a lot of things. Plus, we're seeing rampant inflation. The other thing I think that's also a problem that nobody really wants to talk about is the fact, I mean, there's 2 different things. So there's like everybody is having to tour if they want to make revenue because there's no money coming out of the actual music anymore. That's just a fact.
No. Yep.
You had Weird Al on Blabbermouth the other day saying he has 80 million streams and he got paid $12. So, there's zero money, coming from the actual music sales, which is really a horrible thing for artists. Hang on just one second. My phone is freaking out. I'm trying to decline a call. Anyway, so you have that happening, and then you also have these monster stadium tours that are happening. Like, you've got Metallica, and you've got Motley Crue, and you've got these stadium tours that are just soaking out millions and millions of dollars out of the live revenue market. Like we know, we have a friend, Flotsam has a friend that spent $1,000 for him and his wife to go see 2 Metallica shows. So. When you think about that kind of impact, how much are people going to spend on live performances every year? So it cuts into everybody, it cuts into everybody's revenue. And, it's a tough thing to say, but, it's great if you're Motley Crue or you're, one of these bands that's able to fill up a stadium, that's fantastic. But on the flip side, the shows are super expensive. I think the guy was telling us, he bought like 3 beers and it was like $70 or something like that. And that's money that people aren't going to have to go see smaller artists or artists that, that are maybe playing, much smaller venues. So I think that hurts. I just think the amount of people on the road, it's like everybody's on the road. I mean, and if you look at Blabbermouth, everybody's announcing a new tour for 2024. So you're right. It does make things more difficult for sure.
Yeah. I think what ended up happening, I did a podcast on this with 2 other people, and we talked about this dilemma because what happened was COVID changed everybody's schedules, right? I mean, there were albums that were supposed to come out that people held back. A lot of albums that were held back. Some bands that don't tour that much, they put their albums out, but for the most part, everybody held back their albums for at least a year. Then, as soon as it was announced, because musicians, of course, were the last people to go to work, suddenly everybody out of the gate started touring.
Yep.
And then what ended up happening as a result of that, if you're someone that wants to spend, I know an astronomical number, let's say you spend $1,000 a year in tickets to go see shows, right? Well, if you have 8 bands or 7 bands coming into an area in a week, you're only going to spend that money on so many. So these promoters would book these shows, and then all of a sudden there's this uncertainty. You see 50 tickets pre-ordered. and you want to sell 1,000, but I'm just throwing the numbers out there, and you might
Sure.
get a walk up or you might not, so the risk has gone up. And I remember looking at an invoice. Someone, I have a couple bands that I know showed me the invoice for their tour bus. Okay. These buses, of course, they're $1 million, some of them $2 million, depending on how they're spec'd out. And I looked at an invoice for the month, and the price was triple what they paid back in like 2018. And everything went up. I mean, the cost of renting the bus, the cost per mile. And I think a lot of these companies that own these tour buses, because they sat for a year and a half, some of them 2 years, these $1 million buses, they're paying a giant mortgage on now, that then they had to resurrect and do maintenance on them because diesel engines don't really do well when they sit. And all of a sudden, they want to recoup all that money. And that's what's happened. And it's driven the cost of the tours up, and it's driven the cost of the merchandise up. Then you have merch cuts. People, they don't take the money. A lot of people don't realize this. They don't take the money, a lot of these venues, from whatever's left over. Let's say if you pay everybody, let's say that shirt costs $12 to make, you pay everybody, and you have $20 left over after, profit. They take it off the gross sale. Right. And so now it's become, the one revenue generator that, the traveling t-shirt salesman that a lot of musicians actually are, they don't even get that much money off of it, because then that money actually gets taken from the top, and they might be left with $5, $3, whatever. So it's become a lot harder to do that, in all honesty.
It is. It's horrible. And, the other thing that's tough too is everybody is touring. And we had some Flotsam dates where you literally could not get a tour bus. You literally could not get a bandwagon. You couldn't get, like, a bandwagon is like a smaller version of a tour bus. And they're less expensive, and they can also, do the job. They have bunks and all of that, and you couldn't even get one of those. I mean, everything was completely sold out, which means you're paying more for your crew guys because, there's no crew, everybody's working. I mean, just finding crew guys in Europe is almost impossible. So the costs have gone up at least double, like when we're talking about touring overseas. So yeah, it's definitely made things more difficult, for sure. I mean, and the way the business has gone in the last, I'd say the last 15 years. I mean, if you're in it because you're wanting to get rich, it's probably not the right business to be in.
No,
like if you're in it because you love music and you love the art of what you're doing and you love creating, and it's part of your DNA and it's part of your existence, then you have to do it. And if it's not, then maybe don't, because it's like, if you're in it for other reasons, those reasons are not necessarily there anymore. There used to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There's no pot of gold anymore. So.
Right. Oh, I gotcha. So now Spotify, we talked about bands not getting paid, but one of the things, and everybody, I'm not going to go into the whole Spotify topic as far as what they pay bands. People have heard me rant about it too many times, but the big thing about Spotify is it's now being used as like the industry standard to determine the audience of a band and where these bands can play. And it's almost like they're only using that one factor, that one metric. I was looking for the word, the one metric. It's like they're too lazy to look outside of that. And, what do you think about that? Because before you measured a band's audience by sales, well, you can't really do that anymore, because I think like 11% of sales are physical sales. Right. And so you have to use something. And everybody just by default uses Spotify just because. I mean, it's because it's the easy way to do it. And do you feel that that's accurate, or do you think that they should be using other metrics besides that?
Well, you definitely have to include other metrics. I think the problem is, people are time starved. Like, everybody's very busy, everybody's super busy. And when you talk about, a promoter, and they have to spend time researching different areas. I mean, I understand why it happens, because they're pressed for time, and they're just going, hey, what's Spotify say? Okay, well, that's what we can do. And I understand it, but I do think that you do have to make an allowance for what type of band it is. Is it a younger band?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's a younger, newer band, all of their fan base is going to be digital, and you're going to see it in the digital domain. If the fan base is a little bit older, you know, you're not going to see it as much on TikTok and YouTube and Spotify. You know, and they might have a big fan base, but you're not going to necessarily see it in the digital domain. So I think you do have to take other metrics into account. You know, is that going to happen? You know, probably not, because people, again, you know, they don't have the time to really delve into it. But, you know, that would be my advice. If I was talking to a promoter right now, I'd tell them they definitely have to look at other metrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that's come up, and you've been a musician a long time, the one thing that's been this point of controversy, and I didn't really pay as much attention to it up until about, I don't know, a couple months ago, is AI, artificial intelligence. I don't know if you've seen that, but like I'm looking at these headlines of like Ozzy Osbourne wanting to write a song with the AI version of Randy Rhoads, or, you know, Kiss doing these like avatars of themselves now, right? And you know, some people think it's kind of cool, but I don't know. I find it very difficult. A computer is really going to be able to like determine what somebody might have written or might have done, right? But a lot of people, some people are like really liking this. There's a lot of people that absolutely hate it, you know. And what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence and AI?
Well, you know, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I think that there's some great benefit that can be derived. I think the way it's working now is not good, because originally AI was supposed to make our lives better and easier. I don't think it was intended to, you know, eliminate people's jobs. And I will tell you this: if you're a graphics artist, like you're kind of done. You know, like I mean, your job is pretty much over. I know in China they have 2 million artists out of work now, because it's just so efficient and easy to just put parameters into AI and have it spit out art. And honestly, some of the art it spits out is incredible. So, you know, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, we actually had AI create some artwork for the Fifth Angel album, which we're going to be releasing in PDF. That kind of explains the story and introduces some of the characters and that kind of thing. And, you know, they look incredible, you know, but it's tough, because I think, you know, you have a real danger here of anything that's art related. You know, okay, if AI can spit out a Jimi Hendrix song, you know, that sounds just like something Jimi Hendrix would have written, but it's not, and it's new. And, you know, what's to prevent, you know, AI from just writing everything for everyone? And you know, at that point, you know, what does it even mean? So I think it's a dual-edged sword. I can't really say it's all good or all bad, but I think some of the things we're seeing now are indicating to me that, you know, maybe we're going to see a little bit more, you know, bad than good from it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I do photography. You know, that's not something I talk about too much on the show, but I do photography, and AI has been used for a long time in a lot of photo editing programs. You know, I also do a lot of restoration stuff for, you know, for example, AI has been used, like when I restore old slides and old film, you know, negatives, things like that. It actually, you put the parameters in for that film, that specific film type. It could be anything. And it could be something from the 80s, and it will know what that film should look like before I do some corrections in it. It's not 100%, but they've been using it for a long time. But now you're seeing these photos of, like, I think the one thing I saw, like they had a AI photo of Nicolas Cage singing in like a hardcore band, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you saw that photo, but these things, and they look real. You know, that's the thing.
Well, yeah, I saw a photo of the Pope running from the police that looked 100% real. You know, and that's another danger when you think about media. Okay, if it can make one shot like that, well, then it can make 24 frames a second like that, and it can make video that you will not be able to determine whether this is real or whether this is not real. Yeah. And I think that, you know, in terms of media and news and controlling what people think and controlling what they're seeing and hearing, you know, that has a lot to do with what the Fifth Angel album was talking about. So I think, that's the whole thing, is like controlling the masses, like anything that has that type of power and potential, that there's a tremendous danger there. And I don't think anybody's really necessarily safeguarding us against the dangers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like, I think of the first song, Descent into Darkness, right? I mean,
Yep.
That kind of reminds me of that, what you're talking about. On a more lighter subject, we'll kind of go to something a little bit different. You played in a lot of really, and this is kind of off the Fifth Angel topic. You played in a lot of really cool bands.
Thank you.
You played in Impellitteri. Obviously you were in that band for quite some time, but when I look at the stuff you've done, the Alice Cooper thing always intrigues me, because the album you played on was probably one of his heaviest records that I've ever heard, especially for back then. And it had an interesting lineup. I mean, you got Kane Roberts, who he literally looks like, he looks like this bodybuilder looking dude, and then you get Kip Winger on bass, right? And I just thought that's an interesting album. And how did that come about for you? How did you end up getting in that gig, and what was it like recording that record with those guys?
Well, it was a blast. I mean, honestly, the Alice tour, the first one, and doing that record, that was probably some of the most fun experiences that I've had in the music business. Mm-hmm. In its entirety, like all throughout my career, that's some of the most fun I've had. For probably a couple of reasons. We were all extremely young. It was my first major tour, and I'm not going to say it's first major album, but it was a pretty big record to be involved in. And as far as how it came about, I was playing the Whiskey A Go-Go, which is an extremely, well-known club in Los Angeles. I mean, everybody from The Doors to Motley Crue to Van Halen, you name a band, Guns N' Roses, you name a huge band, they probably played the Whiskey A Go-Go. And I was playing there in '86 with a guy named Randy Hansen, who's still out touring today, and he does a Jimi Hendrix tribute. And some people that were looking for band members for Alice's management saw me play at that show, and they said, "Hey, would you be interested in coming down and auditioning for Alice?" And I was like, sure, And then I ended up talking to the management company, and I said, "Well, are you going to fly people down? Because I live in Seattle." And so, just like Chris DeGarmo said when they were talking about Queensrÿche, you have to, throw your dime and take your chance. And so I had to fly myself down, and they had 3 days of auditions, and 10, I don't know how many guys, probably like 50 or 100 guys they're auditioning, and my chances were kind of minuscule of getting that gig. But I went in, I was prepared. I had been playing live a lot with Randy, and I was completely ready for that experience. And I walked in and played, and next thing I knew, I was on this major tour and playing Joe Louis Arena, sold out, 22,000 people, and live broadcast on MTV. And it was a complete it was just your whole world kind of turned upside down, and it was a blast. I mean, it was Kane and Kip and Paul Taylor was there as well. Artie Finero was this another guitarist. But just a great group of guys. And the weird thing is, everybody was, they had their feet on the ground and their head on the shoulders. Nobody was into drugs. I mean, it was really kind of just amazing, in terms of, when you gather a group of guys like that together, it could have been anything. And we're all still friends to this day. I'm still friends with Kip. I just talked to Kane about like half an hour ago. We do a lot of different work together. I still talk to Paul. I haven't talked to Artie for a while, but it's like we're all still friends. I mean, and that the bond that we have from doing those tours and that record is, it's kind of an unbreakable bond. It's something we share, and it was a very cool time, and it was a great time for audiences too. I've never seen audiences go that insane ever again. Like, I've played tons and tons of shows, and with tons of different maybe the crowd at Wacken in Europe, that's an insane crowd too. So
yes, it is.
That kind of rivals what you were seeing in the mid and late '80s. But I will say that those Alice tours, that first one was just a blast.
Yeah. Speaking of Kip Winger, I mean, that's another band, in my opinion, putting out much better music than they did back in their heyday, back in the old days.
Sure.
The last 3 albums that he's done have been insane, and how great they are. And he's a very talented songwriter. It's funny. I saw him. I'll never forget this. I was probably about 18, 19 years old. I saw him play some like acoustic tour going around Borders bookstores, and he had a solo album out at the time, and I got to actually meet him. But he's a tremendous musician. It's really cool. It's funny how he came out of, because he would tell stories about the Alice Cooper stuff before the whole Winger thing came. But again, we just talked about Flotsam. I talked about Fifth Angel, and Winger's another band. They're just putting out great stuff. And you came up, you brought up the Seattle music scene, which I think is interesting because I had this conversation with another. I had a conversation about that scene years ago with World Dane from Sanctuary. They were a band from that area, and it's an interesting metal scene because Metal Church was up there. You guys were up there. Sanctuary, before they became Nevermore, obviously was up there. And describe what
Queensryche.
Queensryche.
Don't forget Queensryche.
Can't forget them. Queensryche was up there. Just a lot of really great bands. And describe what that scene was like, because when people talk about heavy metal, they're talking about the Bay Area scene, they're talking about New York, they're talking about Los Angeles, but you don't really hear much about some of these bands from Seattle that pretty much. But I know the 3 out of the 4 that I just named are still around.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Back then, it was a pretty robust scene. There was also bands like TKO and Q5, the Heir Apparent, I think I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it was a very robust scene, and the fans were great. There's a video of Pearl Jam. I can't remember what song it is, but they're playing at a venue called the Moore Theater in Seattle. And, it seats, I don't know, a couple thousand people or whatever. But, local bands in Seattle would sell that thing out. That's how, the scene was powerful back then. It was something that had, like an underground current to it. It was electric. It was an electric time, and it was a time where, some magical things were happening. When you think about Fifth Angel, getting signed, we never played a show. Just like Queensryche never played a show, and they ended up getting a record deal. The same thing for us. So we almost emulated what they did. We got pretty close. It's just that they were obviously a lot more successful and earlier than we were too. So I think, first one in always has an advantage. But you look at it and you go, well, it didn't turn out too bad. It's the band had a couple of albums and did fairly well. And it just would have been nice, had the grunge thing. Like, the one thing I didn't understand is why the two things could not exist. Like in Europe, it's not like, grunge didn't have that effect. Like, Europe still respected the metal bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. Grunge bands were making fun of bands like that. They were mocking those kind of bands. And I remember, the singer in Alice in Chains mocking Megadeth. Talking about how lame they were and everything. And I'm just like, wow. Like, I wouldn't think of talking about another artist like that ever. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not in my DNA to mock somebody else's art. Like if you're creating art and there's fans that enjoy it, I don't know what was going on with that whole deal, but it was pretty screwed up.
Well, the other thing that's kind of weird about that is a lot of these bands he was talking about, say Megadeth, they were thrown on the Thrash of the Titans tour. They were put on that tour, right? And they were given some exposure. I know they got like tomatoes and stuff thrown at them because they weren't, Slayer and Megadeth and all those bands, but they were given. They were actually, allowed to open that tour, to get some exposure, and it's crazy. Right. But I think World Dane had told me something about like he knew those guys. Before they were really like huge. Right. That's just kind of weird. But yeah, I agree with you. Back in the 90s, that's ironically is when I got into this music, is that the whole corporate entity tried to erase its existence.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the record companies were instrumental in basically telling you that you were over. I mean, and they almost, it's like they took a sick sense of joy, with them to tell you too. I mean, like they enjoyed basically telling you, hey, your career is over. And so, a lot of bands, I mean, and not only bands, but even producers, I'm good friends with Michael Wagner, and, he produced bands, like Megadeth and Metallica and Ozzy Osbourne. And, like he was known for that era. And there was a period in the 90s he couldn't get a gig. It was just, it was not only the bands, but if you were associated with those bands, you were out of the business. And, I just think that was just so, I mean, what a horrible thing to experience as a musician or as an artist or as a producer. It's just completely uncalled for and ridiculous. And, but the irony is, they were making fun of bands like Kiss and all these things. And I look at it and I go, all those bands are gone. They lasted like 2 years. And bands like Kiss and Aerosmith that they were mocking, lasted for, 40 and 50 years. And, so it's like, I guess who had the last laugh on that one? But I thought it was really a horrible time in music because it killed lots of people's careers. And I thought it was completely unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I sort of saw the resurrection coming in the late 90s. And, when I saw some of these smaller labels, and not smaller labels, but bigger independent labels bringing over bands from Europe, putting their stuff out, because back then there's no social media, no streaming, none of that stuff. You could kind of see that coming. And a lot of these bands making a comeback. All these thrash bands, man, a lot of them all came back. I mean, Flotsam's one of them. I mean, they came back and with a vengeance, really.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And, I think these bands became more popular than probably they were, say, back in the mid to late 80s. I mean, it's kind of just what seems to have happened.
Well, I think so, but I think there's also a problem. Again, here's another one that nobody wants to talk about, and that's the subdivision of metal. Like back, if you look at metal from the 80s, that would encompass Flotsam and Jetsam. It would encompass Metallica. It would encompass Iron Maiden. It would encompass Judas Priest. Like that would all be considered metal in the 80s. Now it's like, oh, well, that's power metal, and this is death metal, and this is thrash metal, and this is whatever metal. There's like 900 different genres of metal now, and the problem with that is, now, like, you've got fans that are like, okay, I'm a power metal fan, or I'm just a thrash metal fan, or I'm just a this fan. And then all of a sudden you're splintering the audience more and more. And so I think that that's actually, another negative development is the fact that we have 50 subgenres for metal now.
I blame journalists for that. Because they came up with the terms, and then because journalists came up with these terms to describe different bands, they have to write about it, so they have to come up with a term, and those terms have now been standardized for the most part. I
think you're right,
and I use those terms because people need to be able to understand. Okay, it sounds like this, and I think that's where you get into it, because if you go to Europe, they don't care about that stuff. I mean, they'll label it like that, but you talked about Wacken, right? I mean, people don't care when you go to that festival. They're going to watch a death metal band, they're going to watch a thrash band, a glam band. They don't care. That's the mentality over there. And like a festival like Keep It True, for example, another example. I mean, a lot of those bands, they're not the more well-known bands, but they're more traditional typically. But people are more open-minded over there. They don't care about the terminology. I blame a lot of the journalists.
That's a good observation. I didn't really think of that, but I'd like to blame somebody. So that's good.
Yeah. Well, that's what it is. Kidding. People come up with that terminology, and now it's just stuck. So you're kind of like, if you're me and other people like me, you have to use it. I mean, that's
right. Sure. Yeah. You don't have a choice, because people want to know what it is, and you have to describe it, and you have to put it into a box. And as a producer, that's what I tell artists. You don't, as an artist, you never want to be put in a box, but the reality is you have to be put in a box because people have to know how to describe you. If they say, we don't know what it is, then you're going to have a real problem, doing anything in the industry. So, I understand the need for genres. I guess I'm not so sure about the need for so many of them.
Yeah, there's like 20 different metalcore genres people come up with. I mean, I there was somebody that named, I think they were mocking the whole terminology thing, like they had deathcore, metalcore, grindcore, and they started coming up with like now you get a lot of these gimmick bands. I get a lot of these gimmick bands now that'll send me stuff. They're all wearing ski masks and Halloween masks. It's like 1999 all over again. Doing my radio show because I was getting, stuff with Slipknot and 50 other bands that wanted to be like them. And then now I'm getting that again, gimmick bands. And the sad thing is some of these bands that they're really talented. The songs are actually pretty good. It's just that you go see them and the guy's wearing a ski mask, it's like, why?
Well, it's kind of, in one sense, that's one thing I always liked about Slipknot is the fact that, they're wearing masks. And I thought that was actually kind of cool because, it's not as easy to be identified because they're very successful and they can walk around and not be, not have a problem. And the other thing is, they can be as old as they want and as long as they can still do their job, nobody's going to be like, they're not going to be aging out. So I think that's actually kind of cool too. It's like kind of a cool benefit for that.
Well, now here's my question. Now, obviously, you're going to be playing some shows. Have you guys decided, hey, this album came out. You guys want to try to come out with one maybe a little quicker than you did? Obviously the pandemic pushes a lot of that stuff back. But have you guys started writing anything? In your downtime?
Well, honestly, we really haven't. I mean, I will tell you this: that record, it did take a lot out of us in terms of just in terms of creativity. It was a laborious process. It took a couple of years, really to make that record. And, I think we're still just trying to, not really think about it yet. I mean, which is, probably like you said, maybe it'd be better to come out with something sooner rather than later. I guess the tough thing is, you work very diligently and you put a tremendous amount of effort into creating this art. And the other problem in the industry right now is just the volume of art, and I think you talked about it in one of your other shows. I watched a clip and you just said, you get so many things that it's like a flood of stuff. You don't have time to listen to all of it. And I think that that's really a problem for the listener too, because there's a million videos that get uploaded every day to YouTube. And there are 100,000 songs that get uploaded to Spotify every single day. So when you think about just the numerics of that, I mean, that's an insane amount of product coming out. Yeah. And so, is there really a need for us to be thinking about, trying to put out more product at the moment? We really haven't thought about it yet. I mean, I think, that the bug that hits you when you have to write an album, there is something that happens, and it's almost like this spark of creativity and this energy, to do it. And right now we don't have that energy to do it yet.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing you brought that up. I'm going to give you some numbers and I'll just read them off to you. Actually, I'm not going to read them. I have them memorized, but I went back into one of my old computers. I was curious about this. Now, I originally started my show, it was a radio show back in 1998. And I went back and I kind of did a rough count. It's pretty close, but the first couple years I did the show, I looked and I had people promoting out, people that were promoting albums. I probably had a week, I'd say in a month, probably anywhere from 10 to 20 records being promoted at any given time. Now obviously metal has grown a little bit since then, but that went up a little bit, say by like 2004. Now you're probably looking at over 100 beats.
Wow.
And to be honest with you, I have no way of ever listening to every single thing that's sent to me. And, one of the things I've also had is that the quality of a lot of the stuff sent to me, there's more quantity than quality. And I equate that to two things. Number one, more people can record whatever they want and send it to you.
Yep.
The second thing is, and this is a perspective I talked about it in an interview I just did. Actually, it was a guy that I interviewed from a band that he brought it up, and it was something I'd been thinking about. Back when you started out, okay, most of the musicians back then, they put all their eggs in one basket. They pretty much stayed in a lot of the same band and concentrated completely on that one band. I was talking about a label from Noise Records from Europe. A lot of the bands that came out of that label, which are all still around, those guys really didn't play on a lot of other records or with other bands. They stayed in that one band, and those bands had a lot of consistency and longevity. Well, now you have people playing in like 4 or 5 different bands, and their creativity is getting scattered about. And I honestly think that's something that actually has hurt the quality of stuff that gets sent to myself and many other people out there. And I think that's a huge difference from when you came up.
Yeah, it's definitely a different scene. I mean, and I think, a lot of musicians are in, 4 different bands now because they have to be, because the revenue is just not what it used to be. And, if you're having to, survive based on your musical income, then that's one of the ways people try to do it. So, I don't have a problem with people doing that. I do think what you did mention something that I do think is important. And I think that is trying to retain a level of quality to what you're doing. I always try and do that as a producer and also as a writer and as a musician. I'm trying to make sure that whatever I put out, you're only as good as your last product, and you're trying to make sure that whatever art that you create is great art, so that hopefully it stands the test of time. I mean, look at here we are in 2023. We're talking about albums that some albums that we made when we were in high school, which is when you think about that, like we never anticipated that those albums would stand the test of time and they would be reissued in Europe and fans would enjoy them. And it's like we thought, oh well, this will be out and it'll be be out for a few years and then it'll be gone. And so the one thing I will say is that's one thing I learned in Fifth Angel. We were very young, but we were always trying to make it great. We really worked hard to make sure the recording was well done and that the parts were tight and everything was in tune and in pitch. And like you go back and listen, I'm very proud of those records because it sounds like we had Pro Tools and we were working on 2-inch tape, and you had to actually play and sing in those days. You couldn't use auto-tune or Beat Detective or any of the things that we have today. And so you had to actually be able to play, and that's why, I think some of the older bands, nowadays you watch new bands and there's a laptop and there's all kinds of tracks on there, guitars and bass and keyboards and vocals and backgrounds. And, they talked to me in another interview, and it ended up on Blabbermouth saying, I said it was okay to use, backing tracks. And I said, in some instances, like you've got an orchestra or something, or maybe some background vocals or whatever. You want to put that on a track, hey, great. But, if you're putting your whole show on tracks, it's like, you can't, what is that? Like as an art, okay, so what am I going to see? I'm going to see people on stage that aren't actually doing anything. Like, what is that? Like, I can't understand that. And if I wouldn't go to a show like that personally.
Yeah. I totally get it, but like special effects and stuff like that, I don't see what the problem would be. I
agree with that. Yeah,
it is what it is. I mean, if you, you might have a keyboard player that can play some of that stuff, or you just run a machine that plays some of the orchestral parts that are being played with the machine anyway.
Right.
So I mean, that's. I mean, I totally get that. I got about a couple more questions and then we'll end off here. So I agree with you on the quality thing. the band that I was talking to, they put out an album sporadically. It might be 8 years, 7 years, 5 years, whatever. But anytime they come out with a record, it gets great reviews. Like I don't remember ever anybody going out and bashing these guys, right?
Right.
And it's always like, man, it's such a long wait. But when that record is coming out, that it's going to be pretty good. And
right.
It's just that's kind of where I come in, because labels want stuff out, they need products, and I've always said that for bands to be successful, you need three things. First of all, you need the product, right? I mean, you need to have something to market, which means songs, t-shirts, CDs, physical stuff, because people still do buy that, but you need something to market. Then you guys all have to get along, right? And have the musical chemistry together. And then you need to really have either really good management or be able to manage your situation really well. And
sure.
And I think the latter, it lacks quite a bit, because a lot of people just don't. They think I'm going to do everything myself, and it doesn't work out that way. But we're in this climate now, man, where it's like nobody's really adapted a viable business model. Like when Lars came out and was complaining about what they were doing, and what was where the future was headed. I mean, he was pretty much correct on that.
He was bang on. Yeah, he was right on with that.
They destroyed the delivery system in the factory where everything was made, right? And it got devalued in a sense. And so I guess this question is, where do you see things going from here? Do you think that, because a lot of these headliners that came out of the 70s, 80s, a lot of them are going away. Kiss is gone. Black Sabbath is gone. Slayer's gone. Motorhead's gone. I'm just throwing band names out there that aren't around anymore. Yeah. And now we need people to replace them. And when you look at how things are now, who's going to be the people to do that? Who's going to headline Wacken in 10 years? I mean, it's just, you think about, where's the future headed?
Well, that's a great question. And, I don't have, I don't claim to know. I mean, I don't know where it's headed. I do think right now, old music accounts for 70% of the revenue. 70% of the revenue from the music industry is from old music right now. So it tells me a couple things. It tells me that people don't necessarily want to hear new music, and we think like, oh, as an artist, you go like, oh yeah, so, everybody wants to hear this new killer song. And it's like, do they want to hear the new killer song, or are they happy to listen to your old song? And so I think, that's a little bit of a challenge. Where does it go in the future? You bring up a good point. A lot of bands, a lot of my heroes are dead. Guys like Neil Peart and Eddie Van Halen, and Lemmy, and all Freddie Mercury. All these people that they were huge when I was growing up, and they're all gone now. And that's kind of a weird thing. So will there be people to take up the mantle? I kind of think there will be. There's always going to be a Billie Eilish, or there's always going to be a Rammstein. Rammstein's been around for years and years. But, you look at, what they're doing with stadium tours. I mean, it's bigger. It's a bigger show than Kiss, and so there's something new and inventive and, very powerful and very successful. So I think there will be bands that will come up and will take the mantle. Will they take it? Will they have 50-year careers like something like Kiss, or 40-year career like Rush? Yeah, maybe not. Maybe that's not going to happen. I don't know. But I think there will definitely be people that will fill the gap for that time period.
Yeah, absolutely. My last question for you, anybody that's going to be checking out the interview, any last words to say to the fans and people that have followed you and are following, Fifth Angel right now,
sure.
or Flotsam, or any of those bands?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I have a lot I'd like to say, but we'll keep it short and just say, I really do, and I really appreciate everybody that spends, I think as an artist, there's no greater honor to me that somebody would spend their money and their time, buying and listening to my art. Like, I think that to me is the biggest compliment, the greatest compliment. The
Right.
fact that I have, so many people that have done that for so many years and have allowed me to do what I do. I have nothing but, extreme thankfulness to them for that. And I will always do my best to, like when we're out and we're signing things, like I sign everything, all the time. Like sometimes people bring a stack of, 30 albums that I played on, and I will sit there and sign every single one of those, because I feel like, if somebody, took the time to really, take their, their treasure, their money, and purchase my art, I'm so honored by that. So all I have to say to the fans is, thank you so much, and I will always do my best to create something that is worth investing in.
Yeah. I guess before we get going, the other thing is Flotsam and Jetsam. Are you doing anything with them still? Are they making a record, or what's?
Yeah, we're right in the middle of working on the next album. Yeah,
Cool.
we're probably, I'd say, about halfway done with it now, and it's coming out great. It's again, you talk about chemistry, and the last two albums popped out very quickly for us, and seem to be very easy. This one is taking a little bit more time. Like, I think, I'm not sure why, but it's coming out great, but it's taking a little bit more effort. And, I can't really, it's just really weird, just like that third Secret album just popped out. And then When Angels Kill was a very laborious process. And, it's like, you don't know why, why was this album easy and this other one not? I think the bottom line, as long as you're making a great album, you just have to do whatever it takes to make it great. And, but yeah, we are in the middle of that process.
Well, I think you also have to follow up two pretty awesome records, and I think the last Fifth Angel album, again, you had to follow up a pretty good record that kind of surprised. I mean, it surprised me when I heard it. I'll be honest with you, and then this new one surprised me even more. With how.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I heard you call it a 9 out of 10, and I was like, that was a great honor. Yeah. I was like, hey, and I'm really glad that it struck a chord with you, because that's what you hope for. I mean, you hope for, you make something that you love, and then hopefully there's a million people that agree with you, and so we have one, so that's great.
I'm not the only one. I mean, there's a lot.
I know.
There's a lot of people that like it, but yeah, I get it. And again, it is a great record, and a very good album, and a lot of songs on it. And it just, when I heard it the first time, it was when I ended up getting it, Nuclear Blast sent me, the promo for me to check it out. I had like 50, again, I caught lost in the shuffle, right? You talked about this. Yeah. I had like 50 other records coming at me. Then I don't know what it was. I listened to it again. I didn't even know Jim Dofka played on it. I mean, I think he talked about the band, and I looked, I'm like, I didn't know he played on it. So I'm like, dude, I like this album's great. And it really is. And for those that know me well, I've never been someone that's an ass kisser. It's just sure. Not my nature. So, I mean, I'll rant about some things too that in the music business people get pissed about, but it's some brutal truths. Unfortunately, some people just don't want to talk about. And but I've always had a premise to never, if it's a band I'm not into, I don't ever talk about them, unless there's some kind of news headline of something like not music related. Right.
Right.
Because if I'm not into it, it's a subjective thing. I'm not going to cut down somebody's work that I'm not into. If there's an album I'm disappointed in by a band I normally listen to, that's a little bit different, but
yeah, sure. Yeah, totally.
There's always bands people aren't into. So, but anyway, I really thank you for coming on. It was a lot of fun. And it was really great to get a little history behind a lot of the stuff you've done and with this band.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here, and best of luck with the show. I hope it continues for another, you said 98. So
yeah.
You've been at it a long time, and I wish you an additional very long career.